The jewelry store sparkled under the glow of festive lights, each bauble and ornament reflecting the warmth of Christmas Eve. The faint hum of holiday music played over the speaker system, blending with the chatter of hurried customers and the occasional chime of the entrance bell. Marcus Johnson stepped through the doors with deliberate confidence, his polished black shoes clicking against the glossy tiled floor. His presence, understated yet commanding, was a stark contrast to the chaotic energy around him. While shoppers darted between counters, their arms filled with potential gifts, Marcus moved with unhurried grace. His tailored coat fell just right on his shoulders, a hint of burgundy scarf peeking from the collar, and his sharp gaze scanned the room with purpose. He wasn't here to browse. He knew exactly what he wanted. Behind the central counter stood Laura, her blonde hair swept back into a sleek ponytail, her crimson lipstick applied with precision. She wore the kind of smirk that often danced on the edges of superiority, a look perfected over years of catering to a particular clientele. She had been working in the store long enough to know the worth of a customer with a single glance, or so she thought. The moment Marcus approached the counter, her smile faded slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing as they took in his appearance. Well-dressed, yes, but there was something about him she instantly dismissed. Maybe it was the quiet way he carried himself, or the fact that he hadn't entered with the same hurried energy as the other patrons. Her tone, cheerful seconds ago, while assisting another customer, dipped into something colder. "Can I help you?" Laura asked, her words clipped and polite in a way that barely concealed her disinterest. Marcus nodded, offering her a polite smile. "Yes," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "I'm looking for something special. A necklace, perhaps, something elegant." Laura's eyes flicked toward the display case behind her, filled with shimmering rows of diamond pendants and gemstone-encrusted chains. But instead of moving to show him the items, she leaned slightly on the counter, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "These pieces," she began, motioning lazily to the case, "are quite exclusive. Are you sure you're looking for something in this range?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his polite smile unwavering. "Yes, I'm sure." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, and then, with an almost imperceptible shrug, she turned toward the display. "Well, these start at about 10,000, she said, her voice carrying just enough emphasis on the price to make it sound like a warning. "And that's just the basic models. The one on the top shelf," she gestured to a glittering diamond pendant set in platinum, "is 35,000. It's our most expensive piece." "I'd like to see it," Marcus said simply. Laura's hand hesitated mid-motion as she reached for the keys to unlock the case. She glanced back at him, her expression hardening. "You want to see that one?" "Yes." His tone remained even, but there was a subtle firmness to it now, a quiet challenge in his calm demeanor. Laura opened the case with deliberate slowness, retrieving the necklace with exaggerated care, as though it might break in the wrong hands. She placed it on the black velvet tray and slid it across the counter toward him. "This one," she said, leaning closer, "isn't just expensive, it's an investment. It's a piece for someone who knows quality and can afford it." Her words were honeyed with condescension, and her smile grew sharper. Marcus picked up the necklace gently, examining the way the light danced on the diamonds. It was exquisite, each stone cut to perfection. He set it back on the tray and looked up at her. "It's beautiful," he said. "I think it's perfect." Laura blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Perfect," she echoed, a slight laugh in her voice. "Well, as I said, it's quite exclusive. Most people prefer to stick to the more affordable items." She motioned toward a nearby display of silver pendants. "We have some lovely options over there if you'd like to take a look." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his composed demeanor. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek leather wallet, but before he could speak, Laura leaned closer, her voice dropping into a more confidential tone. "Look," she said, her smile never leaving her face, "I don't mean to offend you, but pieces like this, they're not really for everyone. Maybe you'd like to check our holiday collection. There are some wonderful options under $500. The words landed heavily in the air between them. A few customers standing nearby turned their heads, drawn by the subtle tension. Marcus inhaled deeply, his fingers brushing the edge of the necklace. "I'm not interested in the holiday collection," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is the necklace I want." Laura straightened, crossing her arms over her chest. Her smile was gone now, replaced with a look of thinly veiled irritation. "Are you sure you're in the right store?" she asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "I wouldn't want you to waste your time." Marcus stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he set the necklace back on the tray and stepped back. Laura's smirk returned, and she picked up the necklace, carefully placing it back in the display case. As Marcus turned to leave, she called after him, her voice loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. "If you change your mind, the bargain aisle is just around the corner." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the room, and Marcus paused mid-step. For a moment, he stood still, his back to her. Then, slowly, he turned his head, meeting her gaze with a look that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. The calm intensity in his eyes spoke volumes. Then, without another word, he walked out of the store, leaving Laura standing behind the counter, her smirk fading as she watched him go. The bell chimed as the door closed behind him, and the store buzzed with renewed energy. Customers resumed their chatter, the brief moment of tension forgotten by most. But Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that this wasn't the last she'd see of the man who had just walked out. The smell of roasted chicken and warm biscuits filled the small but cozy kitchen as Marcus Johnson sat at the worn wooden table, absently stirring his mashed potatoes with his fork. Across from him, Evelyn, his mother, was watching him with the kind of sharp eyes that had always seen right through him. She didn't say much at first, letting the comfortable hum of the evening play out, the clink of utensils, the low murmur of the TV in the living room, but Marcus knew the silence wouldn't last. Evelyn was not the type to let anything go unnoticed. "You've been quiet tonight," she finally said, breaking the stillness with her gentle but probing tone. She set her fork down, folding her hands neatly in front of her plate. "What's on your mind, baby?" Marcus glanced up, his dark brown eyes meeting hers. She was in her late 60s now, her face framed by a halo of silver curls, but her presence was as commanding as ever. She wore her years with pride, her back straight, and her expression calm, even when she was worried, and Marcus could tell she was worried. She always knew when something was weighing on him. "It's nothing, Ma," he said, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just a long day." Evelyn narrowed her eyes slightly, her silence doing all the talking. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair and rubbing a hand over his face. "All right, fine," he admitted. "It's not nothing." She tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. Marcus took a deep breath. "I went to the jewelry store today," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration, "to pick out something for Jasmine. I wanted it to be special, you know, something that shows her how much she means to me." Evelyn's expression softened at the mention of Jasmine. "She's a good one," she said warmly. "That girl loves you, Marcus. You don't need a fancy gift to prove that." "I know," Marcus said quickly, his hand tightening around his fork. "But I wanted to. I wanted to do something big. She deserves that. And it's not just about the gift, Ma. It's about what it represents. Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face. So, what happened? Marcus hesitated, the memory of the jewelry store clerk's mocking smile flashing in his mind. He could still hear her voice, dripping with condescension as she dismissed him. "The clerk," he began, his jaw tightening. "She looked at me like I didn't belong there, like I couldn't possibly afford anything in the store." Evelyn's face didn't change much, but Marcus saw the subtle shift in her eyes, the flicker of anger and sadness that always appeared when she heard about the ways the world tried to put him in a box. "Marcus," she said softly, "you know that's just ignorance. That's her problem, not yours." "Yeah, well, it didn't feel that way," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. He sighed, shaking his head. "I'm not mad because of what she said, Ma. I'm mad because it's not the first time. It's not the first time I've walked into a place like that and felt invisible. Like no matter what I do or how far I've come, they'll only ever see what they want to see." Evelyn reached across the table, her hand warm and steady as it rested on top of his. "Baby, listen to me," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You've worked too hard and come too far to let someone like that get to you. You're Marcus Johnson. You've built something real, something to be proud of. Don't you dare let her or anyone else make you feel small." Marcus nodded, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. He thought of Jasmine, her laugh like music, her eyes always so full of belief in him. She didn't see him the way the clerk had. She saw the real him. That was why he was doing this, for her, for the life they were building together. "Do you ever think," Marcus said after a moment, his voice quieter now, "that maybe I try too hard, that I'm always trying to prove something, even when I shouldn't have to?" Evelyn tilted her head, considering his words carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that you've spent your whole life breaking through walls that weren't supposed to be there in the first place. And maybe sometimes you do try too hard, but that's only because you know what it feels like to be underestimated. And that's not a bad thing, Marcus. It's what makes you strong." He didn't answer right away, his mind drifting back to the past. Growing up on the south side of the city hadn't been easy. His neighborhood was filled with good people, hardworking people, but opportunities had been scarce. He remembered watching his mother work 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, her hands calloused and her feet sore, but her spirit unbroken. He remembered the way she'd always encouraged him to dream big, even when the world tried to tell him otherwise. "You know," Marcus said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "when I was a kid, I used to think you had superpowers. You always seemed so unshakable." Evelyn laughed softly, the sound warm and comforting. "Oh, I had my moments," she said, "but you were my reason, Marcus. You and your sister. I had to keep going because I wanted you to see that it was possible to rise above. And look at you now. You've done it, baby. You've built something beautiful." Marcus nodded, the weight in his chest easing slightly. "Thanks, Ma," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I needed to hear that." Evelyn smiled, patting his hand before picking up her fork again. "Anytime, baby. Now eat your dinner before it gets cold." Later that night, as Marcus sat alone in his apartment, the city lights twinkling outside the window, he thought about what his mother had said. She was right, he had come far. But he wasn't done yet. The memory of the jewelry store clerk still lingered, her voice echoing in his mind. He didn't know what he was going to do about it yet, but one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let her or anyone else define him. Not now, not ever. He reached for his phone, scrolling through pictures of Jasmine, until he landed on one of her laughing at some joke he'd made. She was everything he'd ever wanted, smart, kind, and unshakably strong. She deserved the best, and he was going to make sure she got it, whatever it took. The morning air was cold, the kind of crisp chill that bit at your ears and left your breath hanging in white puffs. Marcus Johnson stood outside the jewelry store for a moment, staring through the gleaming glass windows. The elegant displays of diamonds and gold sparkled under the soft overhead lights, their beauty untouched by the harshness of the world outside. He adjusted the lapel of his wool coat, his movements deliberate, and pushed the door open. The familiar chime echoed through the store, and for a split second, the conversations inside faltered as heads turned toward him. Then, just as quickly, they turned away, the hum of business resuming like nothing had happened. But Marcus felt the shift, that fleeting moment when the energy in the room had acknowledged his presence. Behind the counter, Laura froze when she saw him. Her bright red lips parted slightly in surprise before pressing into a thin line. Her perfectly groomed eyebrows arched just enough to signal her irritation, though she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Back again, I see," she said, her voice laced with a sugary sarcasm that barely hid the contempt beneath. "Persistent, aren't we?" Marcus met her gaze steadily, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Good morning," he said, his voice firm but polite. "I'd like to see the necklace again, the one from yesterday." Laura leaned against the counter, tilting her head in mock curiosity. "Oh, that one. The $35,000 necklace." Her smile grew sharper. "You're sure you're not wasting your time, or mine?" "I'm sure," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. A couple browsing nearby paused, their attention drawn to the exchange. A man in a tailored suit smirked slightly, while his companion, a young woman clutching a designer handbag, whispered something behind her hand. Marcus caught the subtle glances, the shared looks of amusement, but he ignored them. He wasn't here for them. Laura let out a soft, dramatic sigh, straightening up. "All right," she said, drawing out the word as if she were doing him a favor. She turned to the display case, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and unlocked it with deliberate slowness. As she pulled out the necklace, her back to Marcus, she muttered just loud enough for him to hear, "Some people really don't know when to quit." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he focused on steadying his breath, reminding himself why he was here. This wasn't about her, not really. It was about standing his ground. When Laura finally returned to the counter, she placed the necklace down with a flourish, her smile wide and insincere. "Here you go," she said. "Just as stunning as yesterday. Though, like I said before, it's quite exclusive. Not everyone can handle something like this." "Thank you," Marcus said, picking up the necklace. He examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands as the diamonds caught the light. He was aware of her eyes on him, scrutinizing every move, waiting for him to slip up, to give her a reason to dismiss him completely. Behind him, the couple continued to watch, their voices low but not low enough. "Is he serious?" the man murmured, and the woman let out a quiet laugh. Marcus placed the necklace back on the tray and looked up at Laura. "It really is beautiful," he said. "I think it's perfect for what I need." Laura blinked, caught off guard for a moment, before her smile returned, sharper than before. "Well," she said, leaning forward slightly, "it's one thing to admire it, it's another to actually afford it." The air in the room seemed to shift, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus held her gaze, unflinching. "And it's another thing," he said evenly, "to assume you know anything about me." A hush fell over the immediate area, the murmur of conversations around them, quieting as more customers began to notice the exchange. Laura's smile faltered, her confidence wavering for the first time, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the silence. "Excuse me, young lady," said an older woman standing a few feet away. She stepped forward, her posture straight, and her eyes sharp behind gold-rimmed glasses. She was dressed simply but elegantly, her presence commanding in a way that made people step aside without her needing to ask, "Is this how you treat your customers?" Laura straightened, her cheeks flushing slightly. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," the woman said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Marcus, her expression softening. "Young man, are you all right?" Marcus nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "I appreciate that." The woman turned back to Laura, her gaze hard. "I've been standing here long enough to hear the way you've spoken to this gentleman," she said. "And let me tell you, it's disgraceful. I don't care how expensive that necklace is. Your job is to assist every customer with respect, not to judge them based on your assumptions." Laura's face reddened, her smile now a strained grimace. I didn't mean." "Enough," the woman said sharply. She straightened her coat, her voice rising just enough to carry across the room. "I suggest you think carefully about how you speak to people in the future, because if this is how this store operates, I'll take my business elsewhere." A murmur rippled through the other customers, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging uncomfortable glances. Laura opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, clearly at a loss for words. She turned back to Marcus, her forced smile returning. I apologize," she said, her voice tight. "That wasn't my intention." Marcus didn't respond immediately, letting the silence hang in the air. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply, but his tone made it clear the damage had already been done. The older woman gave Marcus a kind smile before stepping away, her presence leaving a noticeable void as she returned to her shopping. The tension in the room lingered though, the unspoken judgment now turned on Laura. She shifted uncomfortably, her confidence shaken. Marcus glanced around, meeting the eyes of the onlookers. Some looked away quickly, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Others held his gaze for a moment before nodding slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice they'd just witnessed. He turned back to Laura. "I'll think about the necklace," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Thank you for your time." Before she could respond, he turned and walked toward the door, his steps measured and deliberate. The bell chimed as he left, the sound cutting through the heavy silence like a sharp note. Outside, the cold air hit him, but he welcomed it. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he steadied himself. The interaction wasn't over, not yet. Marcus knew that much. But for now, he had taken the first step. He had stood his ground, and he had been heard. And as he walked away, his resolve only grew stronger. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Marcus sat at his desk, the city lights twinkling behind him through the floor-to-ceiling window of his home office. His laptop hummed faintly, the screen glowing with the first page of a report. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his jaw, his mind replaying every moment from the jewelry store. The dismissive glances, the cruel smirk, the muffled laughs of onlookers. He thought he'd moved past this kind of treatment years ago, but the sting was still fresh, sharper than he wanted to admit. He clicked open a browser tab and typed the store's name into the search bar. Rows of results appeared, articles, customer reviews, promotional links. He skimmed through the pages until a headline caught his eye. Luxury store faces backlash over discrimination claims. His stomach tightened as he clicked on the link. The article described an incident from 2 years prior, where a customer accused the store of unfair treatment based on their race. The complaint had gained traction online, but the issue was quickly swept under the rug with a generic apology from the management. no action had been taken, and the store's reputation remained largely intact. Marcus frowned, scrolling further. The name in the article stood out: Laura. She had been there even then, her name mentioned as part of the staff involved in the complaint. He opened another tab and searched her name directly. A handful of local articles popped up, but it was the reviews on consumer forums that told the real story. Rude and condescending, one read. Made me feel unwelcome, said another. There was a pattern, a troubling consistency that pointed to someone who had been getting away with this behavior for years. His hands tightened into fists as he read on. It wasn't just about him. This was bigger. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Marcus. Long time, man. What's going on? Sam, Marcus said, leaning forward. I need a favor. Sam Daniels was an old friend, a journalist known for uncovering systemic issues and giving a voice to those who often went unheard. They'd gone to college together, back when Marcus was still figuring out how to navigate a world that seemed determined to shut him out. Sam had always been the type to fight back, to push against injustice with every tool at his disposal. If anyone could help shed light on this situation, it was him. Marcus explained everything: the encounter at the store, the pattern of complaints he'd uncovered, and the lingering sense of anger that wouldn't let him walk away. Sam listened quietly, his voice calm but firm when he finally spoke. You're right to call me Marcus. This isn't just about one bad clerk. It's about a culture that lets people like her thrive. I'll look into it, but I'll need more to go on. Can you get me anything concrete? I'll work on it, Marcus promised, but I need you to start digging. I have a feeling this goes deeper than we think. After hanging up, Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He'd already decided he wasn't going to let this slide, but now the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just about Laura's attitude or even the necklace. It was about the countless others who had been made to feel small, just like he had. He wasn't sure what the endgame looked like yet, but he knew he couldn't let this go unanswered. The next morning, he contacted his lawyer, Anthony Wells, a sharp and methodical man who had helped Marcus navigate the complexities of his growing business empire. Marcus owned a luxury retail chain specializing in high-end clothing and accessories, and his experience had taught him the importance of playing the long game. I'm thinking about acquiring the store, Marcus said bluntly after explaining the situation. Anthony didn't even blink. An interesting approach, he said. What's the strategy? Leverage, Marcus replied. If I own it, I can change it, from the policies to the people running it, and I don't want them to know it's me until the deal is done. Anthony nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics. We can set up an anonymous holding company to make the purchase, he said. It'll take time, but it's doable. Are you sure this is the route you want to take? I'm sure, Marcus said firmly. This isn't just about making a statement. It's about fixing something that's been broken for a long time. As the days passed, Marcus threw himself into the plan with a determination that burned brighter with each new discovery. Sam sent him updates regularly, each one adding more fuel to the fire. There were other complaints, stories of customers humiliated, employees silenced, and a culture that seemed to value appearances over integrity. Sam's voice crackled over the phone during one of their late-night calls. It's worse than we thought, he said. I've spoken to a former employee who says Laura's behavior was an open secret. Management knew but didn't do anything because she was bringing in high sales numbers. They even gave her awards. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. That's going to change, he said quietly. I promise you, Sam, that's going to change. He spent hours poring over financial reports, legal documents, and customer reviews, his resolve growing with each piece of evidence he uncovered. He reached out to allies in his industry, building a network of support that would ensure his plan's success. And through it all, he kept one thought at the forefront of his mind: justice. One evening, as he sat in his office surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing screens, his phone buzzed with a message from Anthony. "The purchase is moving forward," it read. "We're on track for finalization next month." Marcus exhaled, a mix of relief and anticipation washing over him. The pieces were falling into place, but he knew the hardest part was still to come. He wasn't just buying a store. He was taking on a system that had allowed people like Laura to flourish unchecked. It was a battle he couldn't afford to lose, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As he leaned back in his chair, his mind drifted to Jasmine. She'd been his rock through all of this, her unwavering belief in him a source of strength he hadn't realized he needed. He thought of the necklace, still sitting in the store's display case, waiting. It wasn't about the money or the status. It was about showing her, and the world, that he wouldn't back down. The fight was far from over, but Marcus felt a new sense of clarity. This was about more than a necklace. It was about dignity, respect, and the quiet power of standing up for what was right. And as he stared out at the city lights, he knew one thing for certain: he was ready. The article hit the internet like a wildfire. Entrepreneur Ice small-town luxury store in personal grudge match. Marcus stared at the headline on his phone, the words burning into his mind. He scrolled down, the article filled with speculation about his intentions, accusations that he was using his wealth to settle scores, and even thinly veiled mockery about his presence at the store. Anonymous sources had been quoted, and though no names were mentioned, the insinuations were clear. Marcus tossed the phone onto his desk and leaned back in his chair, his hand running over his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The notification buzzed again, the phone lighting up with a new email. It was from Anthony. Marcus grabbed it, skimming through the message quickly. "Leak confirmed. Not from us. Likely internal. Recommend staying quiet for now, but damage control may be necessary." His jaw clenched. Whoever was behind this had done it on purpose, and he could guess who. Across the city, Laura sat in the break room of the jewelry store, her fingers drumming against the table as she stared at her phone. The article had been shared in the group chat she created with a few of the store's senior staff, her inner circle, as she liked to think of them. The satisfaction she felt was tempered only slightly by the nerves in her chest. She knew this was a risky move, but she wasn't about to let some outsider waltz in and threaten her position. This was her territory, her store, and she wasn't going down without a fight. "This will show him," Laura muttered, scrolling through the comments under the article. Most of them were nasty, mocking Marcus or questioning his motives. She smirked. "People love a scandal," she said to no one in particular. One of the store's managers, Greg, walked into the room, his expression uneasy. "Laura," he said, closing the door behind him. "What's this I'm hearing about you talking to the press?" Laura raised an eyebrow. "Oh please," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "I didn't talk to anyone. I just shared some facts. People have a right to know what's happening." Greg frowned, crossing his arms. "This could backfire, you know, if he's serious about buying the store." "And what?" Laura interrupted, her tone sharp. "He'll fire me? Let him try. I've been here longer than anyone, Greg. They need me. I've built this place's reputation." Greg hesitated, but Laura's confidence was unshakable. "Just don't drag the rest of us into this," he said finally, before leaving the room. But Laura wasn't worried. She had spent years cultivating alliances within the store, ensuring that the right people owed her favors and the wrong people were silenced. This was her domain, and Marcus was about to learn that the hard way. Marcus, meanwhile, was pacing his living room, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Jasmine sat on the couch, her arms crossed as she watched him. "You knew this wasn't going to be easy," she said gently, but her voice carried an edge. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," Marcus shot back, "but I didn't expect it to turn into this circus. They're making it personal, Jas. They're twisting everything." Jasmine sighed, standing up and walking over to him. She placed her hands on his arms, forcing him to stop and look at her. "It's only personal if you let it be," she said firmly. "You're better than this, Marcus. Don't let them drag you down." He stared at her, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "It's just, how many times do I have to prove myself? How many times do I have to show them I belong?" Jasmine's gaze softened, but her voice remained steady. "You don't have to prove anything to them. You know who you are. I know who you are. That's all that matters." Marcus nodded slowly, her words grounding him. He took a deep breath, the fire in his chest cooling slightly. "You're right," he said. "You're always right." But the next morning, the fire reignited when Sam called him. "We've got a problem," Sam said without preamble. "I've been hearing rumors that Laura is trying to discredit you. She's telling people you've been harassing staff and making threats." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What? That's ridiculous." "I know it is," Sam said, his voice tight. "But she's smart. She's not saying it directly, just planting seeds. If this keeps up, it could damage your reputation." Marcus sat down heavily, his mind racing. "What do I do?" "Fight back," Sam said, "but carefully. You need proof, something that shows who she really is." Hours later, Marcus was in a meeting with Anthony, his frustration boiling over. "She's trying to paint me as the villain," he said, pacing the room. "She's lying, and people are eating it up." Anthony nodded, his expression calm but serious. "We'll handle it," he said, "but we need something concrete, something that can't be dismissed." That night, Marcus sat alone in his office, scrolling through everything he and Sam had uncovered. Customer complaints, employee testimonies, articles. It was all damning, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. Then, as if the universe heard his silent plea, an email landed in his inbox. The subject line was simple: "You need to hear this." He opened it, his heart pounding. Attached was an audio file. He clicked play, and Laura's voice filled the room. Her words were casual but dripping with venom as she spoke about customers and coworkers, mocking their appearances, their backgrounds, their worth. "Some people just don't belong here," she said with a laugh. "They think money can buy class, but you can smell it on them. They're out of place." Marcus listened, his chest tightening with each word. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone she had belittled, everyone she had made to feel less than. By the time the recording ended, his resolve was unshakable. He picked up his phone and called Sam. "I've got it," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. "I've got exactly what we need." The jewelry store buzzed with the energy of last-minute shoppers, their hurried voices blending with the soft strains of holiday music drifting from the speakers above. Marcus stood just outside the glass doors, his breath clouding in the cold December air. He looked calm, composed even, but inside, his heart pounded like a war drum. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but it didn't break him. It couldn't, not today. Taking one last deep breath, he adjusted his coat and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, and every head turned. Laura was at her usual spot behind the counter, her signature red lipstick catching the light as she laughed softly with a customer. The sound of the bell caught her attention, and her eyes flicked to the door. Her smile faltered the moment she saw him. Marcus Johnson, back again. She hadn't expected him to show his face after everything that had happened, especially not today, with the store so busy. She smoothed her hair and squared her shoulders, her practiced smirk returning to her face. "Well, well," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Looks like someone just can't take a hint." Marcus didn't respond right away. He walked toward the counter slowly, deliberately, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The room seemed to hold its breath, the chatter fading as more customers turned to watch. There was something about his presence today, an energy that demanded attention, that made people pause mid-conversation to see what would happen next. "Good afternoon, Laura," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that sliced through the silence. "Busy day, I see." Laura's smirk widened. "Of course, it's Christmas Eve. We cater to a very exclusive clientele, you know. Not everyone belongs here." She let the words hang in the air, her eyes glinting with malice. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "That's an interesting choice of words," he said, "but I'm not here to argue. I'm here to set the record straight." Laura frowned, her confidence wavering for a split second before she recovered. "Oh, and what's that supposed to mean?" Before Marcus could answer, the doors opened again, and a small group entered. They weren't shoppers. A cameraman adjusted his equipment while a reporter smoothed her jacket and whispered something to her crew. Behind them, a few well-dressed individuals filed in, their expressions serious. The sight of them sent a ripple of confusion through the store. Customers murmured to one another, their curiosity piqued. Laura's eyes darted between the newcomers and Marcus, her smile slipping further. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. "You'll see," Marcus said calmly. He turned to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the room. "Thank you all for your patience. I know this isn't what you expected when you came in to shop today, but I'd promise this is important." Laura's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing, as she tried to regain control of the situation. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "You can't just come in here and—" "Actually," Marcus interrupted, turning back to her, "I can. You see, Laura, there's something you and everyone else here should know." He paused, letting the tension build. "As of this morning, I am the new owner of this store." The room fell silent. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Laura's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. "What?" she whispered. Marcus's gaze remained steady. "You heard me. I purchased this store. I own it now, and that means things are going to change." The murmurs began again, louder this time. Customers whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Marcus and Laura. The reporters moved closer, their cameras rolling. Laura's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully crafted composure crumbling piece by piece. "You're lying," she said, her voice shaky but defiant. "This is some kind of stunt. There's no way." "It's not a stunt," Marcus said, cutting her off. "And I can prove it." He motioned to Anthony, who stepped forward and handed him a folder. Marcus opened it and pulled out a set of documents, holding them up for everyone to see. "This is the deed to the store, signed and sealed. My name is right here." Laura's face turned pale. She looked around the room, searching for support, but found only shocked stares. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and her confidence gave way to desperation. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising. "You can't just walk in here and take over." "I didn't take over," Marcus said firmly. "I bought it, fair and square, and now that I'm in charge, there are a few things I need to address." He reached into the folder again and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and Laura's voice filled the room. It was the recording, the one where she mocked customers, ridiculed their backgrounds, and made it clear she didn't think they belonged. The room went dead silent again as the words played out, each one hitting harder than the last. By the time the recording ended, the tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. Laura's mouth fell open, her face burning with shame and anger. That's not real," she stammered. "You doctored that. You." "It's very real," Marcus said, his voice cutting through her protests like a knife. "And it's not just this recording. There are countless complaints from customers and former employees, all pointing to the same behavior. A pattern of disrespect, discrimination, and abuse of power. You've been getting away with it for far too long, but that ends today." The crowd began to murmur again, this time with anger and indignation. Customers shook their heads, their faces etched with disapproval. The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras capturing every moment. Laura looked around, her eyes wild as she realized there was no escape. "This isn't fair," she cried, her voice cracking. "You're trying to ruin me." "No," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "You ruined yourself. I'm just holding you accountable." He turned to the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't just about one person," he said. "It's about creating a culture of respect and inclusivity. This store should be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That's what I'm committed to building, starting today." The room erupted in applause. Customers clapped and cheered, their approval washing over Marcus like a wave. Laura stood frozen, her face a mask of humiliation and defeat. One of the senior managers stepped forward, his expression grim. "Laura," he said, "I think it's time for you to go." Laura opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the store, the bell above the door chiming mockingly as it swung shut behind her. Marcus turned back to the crowd, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. "Thank you for your patience," he said, "and thank you for believing in something better. This is just the beginning." The room erupted in applause again, the sound filling the store as Marcus stood tall, his mission clear and his victory complete. The world doesn't stop when someone falls, it just keeps moving, indifferent to the weight of shattered pride and broken illusions. Laura sat in the dim corner of a coffee shop, the same crimson lipstick she once wore as a badge of confidence, now smudged and faded. Her phone buzzed on the table, vibrating with the notifications she was too afraid to check. The fallout had been swift. The video of her confrontation with Marcus had gone viral. Clips of her cruel words, her arrogance, and the moment she stormed out of the jewelry store were everywhere. People she hadn't spoken to in years were messaging her, some offering support, others tearing into her with a vengeance. The comments stung the most, strangers dissecting her life, her choices, her character, until there was nothing left but raw nerves and shame. This is what happens when people like her get power. Finally, someone stood up to her. "Disgusting behavior. She deserves every bit of this." She had lost her job, of course. That had been inevitable. But the worst part wasn't the professional consequences. It was the personal ones. Colleagues she thought were allies avoided her calls. Friends who had once laughed at her sharp humor now distanced themselves. Even her family's tight-lipped support felt more like polite obligation than genuine care. For the first time in her life, Laura felt truly alone. Across town, the jewelry store had transformed. The holiday season was still in full swing, but there was a new energy in the air. Customers of all backgrounds browsed the displays, greeted warmly by staff who seemed genuinely happy to be there. Marcus stood near the entrance, watching as a young couple admired an engagement ring. The man whispered something to the woman, and she laughed, her cheeks flushing with joy. It was moments like this that reminded Marcus why he had fought so hard. This wasn't just a store, it was a place where people came to celebrate love, milestones, and new beginnings. It was a space that should feel welcoming to everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from. He had spent weeks working with the staff, implementing changes that went beyond surface-level fixes. There were new training programs to ensure every employee understood the importance of respect and inclusivity. He had established an anonymous feedback system so that both customers and staff could report issues without fear of retaliation, and perhaps most importantly, he had fostered a culture of accountability. Mistakes would happen, that was inevitable, but the response to those mistakes would define the store's future. Mr. Johnson. Sarah, the store's new manager, approached him with a bright smile. The community outreach team is here. They're ready to discuss the holiday initiative whenever you are. Thanks, Sarah, Marcus said, returning her smile. He followed her to the back office, where a group of volunteers was waiting. Over the past month, Marcus had partnered with local organizations to give back to the community. They were organizing toy drives, job training workshops, and mentorship programs. As they talked through the details, Marcus couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what leadership looked like, not just sitting at the top, but using that position to lift others up. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way, through years of struggle and moments of doubt. Later that evening, as the store quieted down, Marcus found himself alone in his office. He sat at his desk, staring at the necklace that had started it all. It sparkled under the soft light, a reminder of the journey he had been on. He thought about Jasmine, her unwavering belief in him, and the way she had encouraged him to stay true to himself. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey you." "Hey," Marcus said, a smile tugging at his lips. "I was just thinking about you." "Oh yeah," she teased. "What about?" "About how you always see the best in me, even when I don't see it myself," he said, "and about how lucky I am to have you in my corner." Jasmine's laughter was soft but full of love. "You're not so bad yourself, Marcus Johnson." They talked for a while longer, their conversation a balm to the lingering weight of the day. After hanging up, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting back to the necklace. Tomorrow, he would give it to her, not just as a gift, but as a symbol of everything they had built together. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The road hadn't been easy, and there would always be new challenges ahead. But as he looked out at the city lights, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced the storm and come out stronger on the other side. And in doing so, he had created something that would outlast him, a legacy of dignity, respect, and hope. At the jewelry store, a plaque now hung on the wall near the entrance. It read, "A place for everyone," a celebration of love, unity, and progress. Customers paused to read it as they walked in, their faces lighting up with smiles. Marcus's story had become more than just his own. It was a story of change, of redemption, and of the quiet power of standing up for what's right. The small velvet box felt heavy in Marcus's pocket as he walked up the steps to his mother's house. The air was crisp with the bite of winter, and the faint smell of pine from the decorated tree in the living room drifted through the open window. Inside, Marcus could hear the soft hum of conversation. Evelyn's voice rose and fell in that familiar, soothing way as she told a story, and the quiet laugh that followed was Jasmine's. He paused for a moment on the porch, one hand resting on the doorframe. His heart raced, but it wasn't the same anxious thrum he'd felt in the jewelry store or during the battles that followed. This was something different: anticipation, excitement, and a touch of vulnerability all swirling together. Marcus pulled the box out of his pocket and opened it just slightly, the diamonds catching the porch light in tiny, perfect flashes. He smiled. It was time. When he walked inside, Jasmine was sitting on the couch next to Evelyn, the two of them laughing like old friends. It was a scene Marcus had seen 100 times before, but tonight it hit differently. Jasmine looked up first, her face lighting up when she saw him. "There he is," she said, standing to greet him. Evelyn turned too, her smile warm and knowing. "Took you long enough, baby," she teased. "We were starting to wonder if you got lost." Marcus chuckled, closing the door behind him. "You know me, Ma. Always taking the scenic route." He crossed the room and pulled Jasmine into a hug, holding her just a moment longer than usual. She smelled like vanilla and something faintly floral, a scent that always felt like home. When he pulled back, his hands stayed on her shoulders, and he glanced at Evelyn. "Ma," he said, his voice steady but soft, "can I have a moment with Jasmine?" Evelyn's eyes flickered with curiosity, but she nodded, rising from the couch with the ease of someone who'd seen this coming before he even knew it himself. "Of course," she said, patting his arm as she passed. "I'll be in the kitchen." Marcus waited until the sound of her footsteps faded before turning back to Jasmine. Her brow furrowed slightly, but there was a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "What's going on?" she asked, tilting her head. Marcus reached into his pocket, his hand brushing against the velvet box. His heart thudded loudly in his chest as he pulled it out, holding it in his palm. Jasmine's eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Marcus," she whispered. He sank to one knee, the motion deliberate and steady, as if grounding himself in the moment. "Jasmine," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you've been with me through everything. You've seen me at my best and my worst, and you've always stood by me. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, and I don't think I could have done any of this without you." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she lowered her hand, her breath catching. "This necklace," Marcus continued, opening the box to reveal the piece that had started it all. "It's more than just a gift. It's a reminder of the journey we've been on and the strength you've given me to keep going. I want this to be part of our story, a story I want to keep writing with you for the rest of our lives." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "Jasmine, will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, slowly, she sank to her knees in front of him, her hands cupping his face. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Marcus slipped the necklace around her neck, his fingers brushing against her skin. The diamonds sparkled, but they paled in comparison to the light in her eyes. He pulled her close, his heart full in a way he hadn't thought possible. Later that evening, they sat at the dining table with Evelyn, who couldn't stop smiling as Jasmine showed off the necklace. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus," Evelyn said, her voice soft but strong. "Not just for this, but for everything. You've become the man I always knew you could be." Marcus reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ma. You taught me everything I know about strength and grace." The next year passed in a blur of change and growth. Under Marcus's leadership, the jewelry store flourished. It became more than just a place to buy luxury items. It became a symbol of progress and inclusivity. Customers who had once felt unwelcome returned, sharing stories of how the store had transformed. The staff, now diverse and empowered, worked with a renewed sense of purpose. Marcus didn't stop there. He launched community programs to support local artists and entrepreneurs, creating opportunities for people who had been overlooked for too long. His vision spread far beyond the walls of the store, touching lives in ways he hadn't imagined. On Christmas Eve, Exactly 1 year after the day that had changed everything, Marcus walked through the store. The air was filled with the soft hum of holiday music and the laughter of shoppers. Staff members greeted him warmly as he passed, their smiles genuine and bright. He paused in front of a framed plaque near the entrance, reading the words engraved there, "Dignity and justice for all." He smiled, his heart swelling with pride. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as he looked around the bustling store, filled with people from all walks of life, he knew this was only the beginning.